Callum Ferguson was a prodigiously talented young batsman. He was selected for South Australia under-19s when he was just 16. He was the youngest player on the Australian Cricket Academy Tour of New Zealand in 2001 when he was, again, just 16. On that tour, he scored a 50 against a Shane Bond-led New Zealand Academy side, which is impressive enough without pointing out the fact that Callum Ferguson was 16 while Shane Bond was 26 and a matter of weeks away from playing his first Test match. He carried this form into 2002, hitting almost 600 runs at the Under-17 National Championships, by far the most of any player. His tournament included a not-out 258 against Queensland that went for almost 10 hours. At barely 17, he was also included in an extended squad for the 2002 Under-19 World Cup, just barely missing selection for the eventual victors. He broke through at senior level in 2003, making his one-day debut for South Australia, and was being consistently selected for the team in the season after. In the 2003-04 Under-19 Championships, he once again topped the run scoring, averaging over 60, ahead of players like Luke Pommersbach, Tom Cooper, Tim Payne, Aaron Finch, Moises Henriques and David Warner. After this, he hits his first domestic half-century, batting at 3 for South Australia against Victoria, and all of this ensured that he was selected for Australia's squad for the 2004 Under-19 World Cup. He put up some very good performances in the warm-ups for the tournament, including a better-than-a-runner-ball 91 against India, before he somehow got out to the bowling of Robin Uthappa, so I don't even know what Robin Uthappa bowls, so I don't know how that happened. However, in the final warm-up before the start of the tournament, he was struck down by a knee injury. Had he not been injured, he was almost certainly going to be Australia's main batsman at the tournament, and Australia's title defence probably would have gone better than it did. They were bundled out in the group stage because they couldn't handle Tinashe Panyangara and Elton Chigumbura's ferocious pace bowling, and then spent the rest of the tournament playing in the plate group playoffs, which meant that they bowled Scotland out for 22 at one stage. Callum Ferguson's knee injury, as it turns out, was really bad. It was an ACL tear, so his season was completely done. But in the off-season, he was still awarded a full contract with South Australia, and then became a core part of their batting lineup from the next season onwards. He made his Sheffield Shield debut in the first round of the 2004-05 season, playing every single match of the season, and finishing as South Australia's leading run scorer, and in the top 10 run scorers across the entire competition. He still only had about half the amount of runs that Michael Bevan scored, who finished at the top of the rankings. And Michael Bevan also played in one fewer game. Somehow, Michael Bevan hit 8 centuries in 9 games that year for Tasmania, who somehow managed to finish bottom anyway. Ferguson's next few seasons were solid but unspectacular, averaging in the 20s in one-day cricket and in the 30s in first-class cricket. His T20 record, too, in an era when that wasn't particularly important, was particularly unremarkable. But the 2008-09 season would see him turn the page and step up to another level. In that season, he hits 2 Shield centuries, his first centuries in 4 seasons, and averaged over 40 for the first time in his entire career. But more than that, he had an outstanding one-day cup for South Australia, finishing near the top of the run scoring, and he went at an excellent strike rate of nearly 100. It's off the back of this that Callum Ferguson earns his first international selection, called up to both Australian white ball squads in the same year as the T20 World Cup and the Champions Trophy. In the Chappell Hadley one-day series, despite the fact that he's only batting at 6 and even as low as 7, he starts his international career really well. Playing as a finisher, he makes over 100 runs in the series and is only dismissed once, whilst striking at a very healthy strike rate of 136. He's less successful in the only T20 of that series, making a 9-ball 8 in a match where Nathan Bracken is the man of the match for a 0-wicket haul. Ferguson will play 2 more T20Is in his career from this point, in an era when they're relatively infrequent at international level, and he has little success in these fixtures. He doesn't end up making the 2009 T20I World Cup squad, with Cameron White being the player preferred to replace Andrew Symonds when he was sent home on the eve of the tournament. Andrew Hilditch, the chairman of selectors, claimed that Ferguson's omission was the hardest selection choice of any player in the squad. But Callum Ferguson did have a very decent one-day international career for a little while. He followed his successful series against New Zealand with a solid performance on the tour of South Africa, twice top scoring after top order collapses, having to rebuild the innings. Much the same again in a low scoring series against Pakistan, and then he had a very good series against England right before the start of the Champions Trophy, helping Australia to a 6-1 series victory back when we had 7-match one-day international series. Going into the Champions Trophy, Callum Ferguson had played 20 ODIs in just 8 months. He was averaging over 50 and was striking at a then particularly healthy strike rate of 88. In a team that was considered a very strong chance at winning the entire tournament, Callum Ferguson had quickly established himself as a crucial member of the middle order. He'd proven that he had the ability to finish games and save innings from many different positions in the match and many different positions in the batting order. And in the Champions Trophy, Ferguson played every single game for Australia as they went undefeated and, in the end, won the tournament with relative ease. However, Ferguson barely had to play any role in the tournament at all, and though he could well have hit the winning runs for Australia, with his team having reached the target 4 wickets down in the final, it was James Hopes who came in at number 6 to bat for Australia in that game because Ferguson once again injured his knee in the 47th over of the New Zealand batting innings, just like he had before the Under-19 World Cup all those years earlier. Within a week of winning the Champions Trophy, Ferguson was ruled out for the entire Australian summer, which was only just about to begin, and he would require a knee reconstruction, having once again injured his ACL. Still, signs were pretty good for Ferguson. He was retained on Australia's national contract list, and with players like Michael Hussey and Ricky Ponting clearly reaching the end of their careers, it was a sign that he was still seen as the player of the future. He makes his return to professional cricket in 2010-11, starting with a very successful Champions League T20 campaign, remember that, for South Australia, where he finishes as one of the top run scorers in the whole tournament. And in his return to Sheffield Shield cricket, he hits a near runner ball 129 against a pretty good Western Australia attack. He's recalled to the ODI squad, though he doesn't bat in his one outing, and he's then named in Australia's Ashes squad for the 2010-11 series. Now, for this series, Australia bizarrely named a 17-man squad for a home Test series, and then immediately played a bunch of their players in an Australia A game against England to see who should be cut from that squad. Callum Ferguson and Usman Khawaja were among those cut from the side, and he didn't appear for Australia in that Ashes series. The rest of his domestic season wasn't so successful, with one more Shield century being his sole contribution above 50 in either first class or one-day cricket that summer. But he's still in and around the one-day international side and earns his next chance in the post-Ashes one-day series when Shaun Marsh gets injured. But his performances are middling, and in a tour of Bangladesh in April 2011, he plays 2 more matches, bats in one of them and makes a 3. Ferguson could probably not have imagined at the time that at only 26 years of age and still averaging over 40 for Australia in ODIs, that he would never play another white ball international for Australia. He performs creditably for Australia A on a tour of Zimbabwe, and across these next 2 Australian summers performs very well in the One Day Cup, but just okay in the Sheffield Shield. His T20 returns are not particularly good, but he still picks up 2 seasons worth of IPL money from the Pune Warriors. And he's still playing for Australia A relatively frequently too. By 2013, he finds his feet again in red ball cricket. From the start of the 2013-14 summer through to the end of 2015, he hits over 2,000 first-class runs at 52, hitting 600s. And his one-day form is also good. By this point, he is once again firmly in the picture for international selection. However, his 2015-16 season is abruptly interrupted by, once again, an ACL tear in December of 2015, which he picked up during a BBL practice match. Regardless, he starts the next season perfectly. He scores a mountain of runs in the One Day Cup, and then in his first Sheffield Shield match of the season scores a century against Western Australia. He does score a duck in his second match of the season, batting only once in each of those games, but after a 177 run defeat for Australia in the first test of that summer, and the opening up of a spot in that squad due to an injury to Shaun Marsh, Callum Ferguson and Joe Burns are both added to Australia's test squad to face South Africa in the second test of that series at Hobart. The day before the test, the messaging in the media is really clear. Burns is definitely in the team, but it's between Callum Ferguson and Mitchell Marsh for the last spot in the 11. And in the hour before the start of play, Ferguson is handed his baggy green by Greg Blewett. South Africa win the toss, and with a lot of weather about, overcast skies, and with a bowling attack of Vernon Philander, Kagiso Rabada, and the staggeringly underrated Kyle Abbott, there's no surprise that Australia are sent in. And the South Africa attack run absolutely rampant. Both Australian openers are out within the first 2 overs. Khawaja's stodgy stand of 4 runs is undone in the 9th over, and then Adam Voges nicks off first ball. Australia are 4 wickets down for only 8 runs on the board. It's not exactly the ideal time to be strolling to the crease for your first innings in Test cricket, and Ferguson finds himself facing a hat-trick ball. And though he's batting at 6, he's in within the first 10 overs against a swinging ball under lights with dark clouds overhead, against Vernon Philander, who, I will remind you, is basically the best bowler in the world at the time. He defends the first ball shakily, and he and Steve Smith survive a few overs together. In the 13th over, just after Steve Smith almost accidentally kills Vernon Philander, Kyle Abbott comes in to bowl to Ferguson. Ferguson nurdles it to Dane Vilas in backward point, who misfields. As the crowd start ironically cheering the misfield, Smith and Ferguson set off for a run, and then they set off for another. As Ferguson sets for home at the striker's end, at some point he must have realised that Dane Vilas, who had only just made a simple fielding error, had thrown an absolute rocket straight at the stumps from about 40 metres out. Callum Ferguson, despite putting in a good dive to try and get home, is caught well short of his crease. Out for 3. Australia are now 5 for 17. And even worse for Callum Ferguson, his brother, who had just flown all the way from England, is now getting replayed all over the coverage, storming out of his seat, and it's going viral on social media. Soon, it's 6 for 31. Steve Smith's 48 not out and some swinging from the lower order gets the score to 85 all out. And Joe Mennie, also on his test debut and also in his last test match, is the second top scorer of the Australian first innings with 10 runs. After an early wobble with South Africa losing 3 quick wickets in succession to find themselves 3 for 46, they eventually make 326 off the back of a Quinton de Kock ton and a Temba Bavuma 70. When Australia start their final innings, well over 200 runs behind, there is briefly some hope, with Warner, Khawaja and Smith making decent scores between them, but it's never enough. Ferguson comes to the crease at 4 for 135, and in a short stay at the crease contributes 1 run. On his 11th ball, Rabada bowls a pretty nasty delivery, and Ferguson is completely bewildered by it, because he plays a very strange shot to it where he looks like he's trying to leave it and it bounces straight off his glove to the slip cordon. It's a pretty horrible way to end a pretty rough test debut. Once Ferguson's out, Australia barely last another 10 overs before they're all out, routed by an innings at 80 runs. So, how do Australia react to losing a home test series so comprehensively? Do they stay the course and back in the players who they had clearly just identified as the best in the country, with consideration of the fact that South Africa were an unbelievable bowling team? Well, no. I have never seen an Australian team react so violently to losing a match or a series as Australia did in this instance. The media were basically melting down, and I think the Australian selectors and the Australian cricket team more broadly wanted to make a bold statement about how unacceptable this loss was to them. So they dropped 5 players: Joe Burns, Adam Voges, Callum Ferguson, Peter Neville and Joe Mennie. Of those 5 players, only Joe Burns would ever play another test match. In their place, Matt Wade, Jackson Bird, Matt Renshaw, Nick Maddinson and Peter Handscomb came in. These latter 3, Renshaw, Maddinson and Handscomb, were paraded around the media as the batsmen of the future. Matt Renshaw was only 20 years old, a very ominous sign to suggest that whilst Ferguson had only just made his test debut, at 32 he was already considered to be yesterday's man. And in what looked like an instant vindication for the Australian selectors, Australia would comprehensively bounce back in the next test and then immediately beat Pakistan 3-0 in the second series of the Australian home summer. Nick Maddinson really struggled. He had no form at all going into that series and he was really poorly handled. And he was nowhere near the batsman he would eventually prove himself to be when he moved to Victoria at that stage. But Handscomb and Renshaw ended that summer with extremely high stocks, and Peter Handscomb averaged basically 100. Smith, Warner and Khawaja were basically immovable at the top of the order, and when Australia replaced Maddinson in the final test of the summer, they didn't go back to Ferguson. They again looked to the future and selected Hilton Cartwright. Ferguson's cards weren't marked. He'd only just earned a test debut, but he would have to work pretty hard to get back into the test side. But his summer turned into a bit of a disaster. Only 2 days after the Hobart Test, he and most of the test squad were returned immediately to the Sheffield Shield. And against Queensland he made 4 in both innings. A week later and he was dismissed for 5 and 24 against Victoria, and in the next round he made 7 and 12. This meant that since getting selected in the test squad, he had made only 60 runs across 8 first-class innings, and all in the space of less than 4 weeks. The Shield then went into recess for the Big Bash, and he had an alright Big Bash. But in his next 2 Shield matches, only made 42 runs across 4 innings. He then finally hit some form, hitting a 70 and 100 against a very good New South Wales attack, and he then hit a 90 in the next round. Despite his terrible season form, South Australia qualified for the Sheffield Shield final, but he had a forgettable match, making very few runs on an absolute road in Alice Springs, as Victoria won the game by drawing. The summer where Ferguson finally earned his test debut after years of toiling away, and where South Australia made the Shield final for the second year in a row, turned out to be one of the worst of Ferguson's entire career in terms of output. But as a professional cricketer, his story doesn't just end there. His next Sheffield Shield season was consistently good throughout and was a very strong bounce back. He never really had another great Shield season after that, but he continued to be a force in white ball cricket at domestic level. He would have a relatively successful stint at Worcestershire, where he was just fine in the county championship, but absolutely dominated the One Day Cup and the T20 Blast in 2018. In that season, he hit his first ever T20 century and also hit 192 in the One Day Cup to help Worcestershire to their highest ever successful chase in English one-day cricket. He would also then hit his only ever BBL century in 2019 and would have his most fruitful BBL seasons of his entire career right at the end of his career. He retired from first-class cricket halfway through the 2020-21 season. This was influenced by being omitted from South Australia's Shield side for the first game of the season. In his final innings in first-class cricket, he batted for 5 hours to make 97 runs, falling just short of a fairy tale century, with both teams united in imploding him off the ground. And at the end of the game, both teams gave him a guard of honour as he exited the playing fields. He played his final T20 and one-day match in the same summer, and has since retired into the typical pathway for ex-players around his age of punditry, commentary, and of course playing in random Legends leagues that I don't think anyone watches unless you're a gambling addict. A few people asked me to make a video on Callum Ferguson. I think there is a pretty widely held belief that he was pretty hard done by as a Test and international cricketer. And I think there's a pretty fair argument there. Reflections on his retirement in the media generally focused on how brutal his axing from the Test side was, and how unfortunate he was as a cricketer moreover, especially with his knee injuries. But I was going to make a video on Callum Ferguson anyways before anyone asked me to, because I've always really liked Callum Ferguson as a player. He was always a player who was really easy to support, who you always wanted to do well, and I actually remember when I played International Cricket 2010 on the Xbox 360 that Callum Ferguson was always a player that I would select in the Australian squads. And when I started playing Cricket Captain, which the first game I played of that was 2013, he, Tim Payne and Tom Cooper likewise were players that I would always immediately select in the Australian squads, probably at the expense of Ed Cowan and Brad Haddon, who I really must insist I do like those players as well. But I think it's really important to remember that just as Callum Ferguson is remembered as the face or the scapegoat of that Hobart disaster, he is also a guy who came back from 3 devastating ACL injuries, won an ICC trophy with Australia, and retired as a beloved legend of South Australian cricket, which I would say counts as making a pretty fair go of professional cricket.